So for me, it's a huge pleasure to welcome again to this college our visiting fellow, Sharon Dodua Otoo. Sharon has done so many things, I can't possibly list them all, but for me, one of the really important things was that in 2022, she was the Schroeder Writer in Residence at Cambridge. She was our inaugural Schroeder Writer in Residence. We founded this residency in order to be able to invite her. And that was in the German section. And one of the things that not everybody knows about Sharon is that she has a BA in German from Royal Holloway, University of London. So yeah, it's always fun to talk shop with her as well. She was then, having been Schroeder Writer in Residence, she'd already been signed up to be the Max Cade Writer in Residence at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania in 2023. She, in the meantime, won the Medal of Merit of the City-State of Berlin for her contributions to politics and culture. And if anybody's been to Berlin and have a sense of what kind of politics and culture happen there, it's quite a competition to get that medal. So yeah, extraordinary achievement again. She's been the curator now for a couple of years of a Black Literature Festival in Germany called Resonances. And if anybody was here last year for the Schroeder lecture, which Sharon delivered in this hall, they all have heard her speak about that, and that ran last year and then ran again very successfully this year. She's the author of any number of essays on mixed political and cultural topics. She edits a book series called Witnessed for the publisher Assemblage, and she's also been editor of a number of books, including one called The Little Book of Big Visions, How to Be an Artist and Revolutionize the World. So there's a how-to book for you. She has a couple of novellas. The Things I'm Thinking While Smiling Politely is on my list of best book titles ever. Seriously, it's a great title. And that came out in 2012 in the original English, and then in 2013 in German. And then another novella called Synchronicity, though it was written in English, appeared first of all in German in 2014 and in the original English in 2015. She also has written a number of short stories, the most famous of which is Herr Grüttrup Sits Down, which won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in 2016. That's the significant short story prize in Germany, and that raised your profile immensely, I think. Her novel, which we're talking about this evening, and which you will be able to get copies of afterwards, is Ada's Realm, which appeared in German in 2021, and then in the English translation by John Chopolitzy this year in 2023. It was this year, wasn't it? Yes, it was, yeah. So it's had rave reviews. In Germany, it was shortlisted for the first Novel Prize in 2021, and it was one of North German Radio's best books of 2021. So I'm very excited. It's in English, and I'm very excited to be able to present it to an English-speaking audience with Sharon here this evening. She is in conversation with Chalo Wire, who is a PhD student working with me, but he has an enormous history that precedes this work. He took his BA at the University of Nairobi, and then an MA in Kiswahili at the University of Nairobi. He also has an MA in French from the Sorbonne, and he has an MPhil in European Languages and Cultures from the University of Cambridge, which is how we met. He has a master's in journalism from Carleton University, Ottawa, and he worked for a while as a freelance journalist for the BBC in Kenya. We're very fortunate in the project team that I lead to have him as our new project PhD student. It's a project that's being funded by the EU and by UK Research and Innovation called the Cartography of the Political Novel in Europe. And we are looking at novels as a resource for building democratic societies and for developing justice, and how people can be encouraged to read them as a resource for those things. We think that important ideas travel around the world and between countries in novels, and that they expand what we know and how we understand the world in ways that are also remarkably enjoyable. So it's win-win. I need to say a couple of thank yous, and then I will let the speakers speak. Thank you very much to the DAAD Hub at Cambridge, who are funding the drinks that you'll hopefully stay to enjoy afterwards. Thanks to my own department, the German section, who are also funding this event. And thank you very much, as always, to the Intellectual Forum, who are fabulous hosts, and it's really wonderful to be here. And I will now pass over to you two for the proper bit of the introduction.
So, I'm just going to turn this on. I think. I'm just going to taste this. I hope I'm all right. Am I all right? No? No? Sorry about that. It's all right now? No?
Try speaking.
All right. I hope I'm okay now. No? No, I'm shall we just go on anyway? So I think I'm loud enough.
Yes, you can. Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. All right. So welcome back to Jesus College, Sharon. One more time. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to have this conversation with you. Like many others here today, I enjoyed reading the English translation of your first novel, Ada's Realm, and I'm hoping to read it in the original German one day. So as an aspiring writer myself, I found the many experimental liberties you took with your novel inspiring. So the novel speaks to me on many levels, as a person who can identify with several of the characters that rendered powerless and voiceless, and subjugated based on class, disability, gender, and race. So to start us off, perhaps you could read for us a passage from the novel, just to start us off.
Okay. I'm happy to do that. I'd like to quickly take the opportunity to say thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organizing this event and for the warm welcome. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. I know some people have traveled really far to get here to be, so it's a great honor for me. And I wondered if it might make sense if I just say a couple of words about what the novel is about, in case people haven't read it. So when I talk about the novel, it's a very complicated novel to summarize. And when I talk about it, I say it's the story of a young woman who was born in London and moved to Ghana at a very young age because her mother died. So she went to live with her father's sisters, who she also called mothers. And she lives in Ghana until she's about early 20s, where she finds out that she has a half-sister that lives in Germany. And at some point she travels to live with her sister, Elle, and the part of the novel that takes place in Berlin in 2019 talks about this main character, Ada, her search for a place to live. She's pregnant by then, has split up from the father, and there's a very very vivid depiction of how hard it is for her to find a place to live. And it's not only about the physical flat, but it's also her place in society and so on, a safe space, if you will. By the time the reader gets to that part of the novel, however, they'll recognize that there's certain themes, certain names, certain areas, geographical areas and histories that are resonating in 2019 in Ada's story. And those are the parts that took place in the historical part of the novel, which is the first half. And the three geographical areas and eras that I chose are 15th century West Africa, so just before colonialism kicks in, 19th century England, specifically in London, around the time of the revolutions in Europe, and also the Irish potato famine, and 1945 in Germany. And each of these historical eras, there's also a young woman called Ada or Ada, depending on the background. And the way that the novel's told, the reader understands that you can read this as the story of someone who's lived many times and continues to face similar challenges, and how does she deal with those challenges going forward. So I'll begin just by reading the first few pages,
Absolutely.
the opening of the novel,
Right.
of the English translation of the novel, which is fantastic. And if John is online, you're a rock star. So the beginning of the novel is deliberately placed in West Africa in pre-colonial times, because I really wanted to sort of write something that counteracted the notion that Africa doesn't have a history. We know Kant said Africa doesn't have a history. And the scene that I describe at the beginning of the novel shows that there is a group of women, it's a matrilineal society where they are living and they are arguing and they are mourning and they are loving. These are human beings that were living at the time, and they very much do have a history. Totope, March 1459. During the longest night of the year, blood clung to my forehead and my baby died, finally. He had whimpered in his final moments, and Nalamle had caressed his cheek. How lovely, I had thought, that this would be his final memory. She lay just beside him, the child between us, and her head rested next to mine. Nalamle's eyes shimmered as she assured me it would not be much longer now. God willing, she whispered, because all of our mothers were sleeping on the other side of the room. But Nalamle's voice would have given out at any moment anyway. Together we had cried and prayed at my baby's side the last 3 nights. I could barely hear her, and I understood her even less. While she caressed him, she had stared at me as if surprised by my confusion, though the words, "How would you know?" never left my lips. In an already unbearable situation, this moment was particularly absurd. Nalamle always knew. But in that moment, it was quite literally a matter of my own flesh and blood. I did not want to seem clueless to her, so to distract myself, I scratched my forehead. I scratched and I forgot that I had blood under my nails. The few candles Nalamle had gathered and placed before the doorway flickered. It was this way with Kofi too. She breathed softly, as if she did not wish to disturb my son while he was dying. Shame on me. This was not so long ago. The ensuing silence resulting from my shame and her sympathy accompanied us through the final tortured breaths. The candles wept. Outside, Nalamle had prepared a tiny pad of palm leaves to lay him out in the moonlit courtyard. She spread a white cloth over it. There would be no grave. The boy did not even have a name. He was only 5 days old. And yet he had still tarried longer than my first child, also a boy. He had opened his eyes immediately after birth, looked around, and evidently not liked what he had seen. That little one had left us before I could even take him in my arms. Nalamle squeezed my hand once, briefly, then shifted to her knees and stood. I wanted to as well, but with great effort, I only managed to make it halfway, a squat. It was about time to carry out his body. I remained on the floor. She bent over one of the flames. I remained on the floor. She blew one candle out, then the next, and then another. Finally, she lifted the baby's body, carried him from our room. I remained on the floor. The darkness comforted me. Through the open doorway, I watched how Nalamle cradled my baby in her arms, how she lay his body gently down onto the palm leaves, how she adjusted his head lovingly, pressing his lips together, how she blinked her tears away. I leaned back against the wall, closed my eyes, and dozed off. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. So I was going to ask, how would you say that your work as a writer and you know, the public profile that it has given you have helped to advance the causes that are closest to your heart?
So often when I talk about my work, I identify myself as a political activist and as a creative writer. And sometimes the question arises, how can you do both or something like that? Which one weighs more? And I actually see them both as quite tightly linked. And I think that's to do with my understanding of what activism is. Of course, there are different forms of activism. Some involve marching on the streets, organizing demos and that kind of thing. For me, my activism is a way of being in the world. The German word would be Haltung. So it's a way of understanding that in a society where some people have more power than others and some people are disadvantaged because they don't have as much power and influence as others do, I can take a position, right? And I can support those who are being marginalized. And so I think of myself as someone who is quite privileged as a writer. I have the opportunity to come here and read from my work and talk to people. And in that way, I have an influence, and I like to use that influence to inform maybe public discussions and debates, but also quite concretely, Sarah mentioned the literature festival that I curated. That was out of a recognition that many people who live in Germany, who are Black, who are born and raised in Germany, speak no other language, see themselves as very unrepresented in the literature scene in Germany. And that's partly, there are many reasons for that, but partly it's because of a lack of networking, lack of access to the right networks. So because I'm where I am and I have this activist position on these matters, I use that position to create access, to introduce people to other people. So that's, how I do it.
Great. Now, I had the impression of noticing traces of different belief systems, ranging from various African and Asian religions to New Ageism in the novel. Would it be right to suggest that this novel was on a certain level, a personal spiritual journey on your part?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about whether this was a spiritual journey as such. I guess many writers, many creative writers are somehow processing things that are important to them, processing themes and life questions. And in that way, in any case, it's spiritual. But yeah, you're right. I did also think a lot about spirituality with this novel. The way that I described the novel at the beginning of the talk, I left out quite a bit of it. And one of the pieces that I left out is that there is a second narrator. So in the beginning of the book, the narrator is the character Ada or Ada. And then there's a second narrator for a majority of the book, which is a being that exists in the realm where we all are before we're born and to which we return when we die. And this realm is called Asamando in Tree, one of the languages of Ghana. Maybe in German it would be called Jenseits. Maybe in English it would be called Heaven, I'm not sure. In any case, part of the novel is told from a perspective of a being that's stuck, literally stuck there, because this being really wishes to become a human being, really wishes to be born, and is somehow required to learn something before it can be born. And that was an idea that I had of thinking about all of us as, myself and my readers as spiritual beings. And maybe what if, a thought experiment, what if we were all somehow on this journey on Earth with a question or with a challenge, something that we had to learn, and then if we don't quite make it to process that information, we're given another chance. Like that was in some way a spiritual consideration, yeah.
Now, going by the experiences of the various incarnations of Ada, as well as other female characters in the novel, the condition of women does not seem to change much from region to region, from culture to culture, and from age to age. So what would you say is the state of play in the ongoing struggle for gender equity around the world. And how does this inform your work and writing?
Yeah, it's true that with this novel, I focused very much on female lives. Actually, one of my close friends who moderated the book premiere in German said that this was a book that took female lives seriously, which I liked as a description. My aim, however, wasn't so much to think about how they're marginalized and how women suffer, although that is definitely a major part of the story. But my real aim by telling these stories of trauma and pain was to look at, within each of the scenarios that these women find themselves in, how do they still manage to resist and assert their humanity, even in the most dire of circumstances. So the third character, Ada, is a person who is in forced prostitution in a concentration camp in Germany. And it's described that she literally has nothing. Nothing belongs to her anymore, not even her own body. And what I tried to do with that part of the book is to show, even in that circumstance, she still manages to assert a kind of resistance in when these terrible things are happening to her. She imagines herself out of her body. She beams out. I think it's called disassociation. She imagines herself on the moon. And that's an agency that I wanted to give back, because so often marginalized people are described by privileged people, and then it tends to be focused on all the bad things that happen to them and how poor they are. And I wanted to tell a story of resistance.
Great. So in Ada's realm, race and class intersect. And Ada's realm also reaches back into history and brings into view an intersectionality between ableism and discrimination against Irish people. In particular, revisiting the catastrophic social and human cost of the potato famine in Ireland in the latter half of the 19th century. So, to what extent would you say that your own experience has shaped the way that you have tackled the intersectionalities around gender, race, class, and disability in Ada's realm?
Yeah, I was writing from a position of what I know, so it's very, very much shaped by my ideas, and it's not so much that I experience each and everything that happened in the book. It's not an autobiography, but it is a book that looks at emotions. So specifically, the book is about how the history affects the present, and particularly traumatic events in the past, how they can still affect you, either at an individual level if you had something happen that's traumatic, or societal level. How do we deal with the big questions? And that if we try to ignore them, they still pop up. So those, of course, are themes that I very much think about. And if I get very specific, the Irish potato famine, that's an example of a part of the book where it was important to me to think about my position, my role as a person. I'm an English person as well, among other things. And I was born and raised in London, and I went through the English education system. And I learned nothing about the Irish potato famine. And this is kind of tragic, because it was such a... I know that I even went to school with children of Irish people, and of course they knew exactly what had happened. They still carried that history literally in their bones, you know? And I thought about that a lot when I was writing this book, about how can I write about this subject that, for reasons, was not taught to me as an English person, but is very definitely part of my history. It came up even during Brexit, that one of the horrible politicians made a comment about the potato famine because the Irish weren't voting in the right way. And so I just thought, no, this is really a subject that has not been shed enough light on, in my perspective, from my background. So I wanted to look at this story, not in terms of how poor the Irish are, but in terms of what were the English doing. And I look at it through the eyes of Ada Lovelace, who was an English noblewoman, and I describe how she tries to hide, or tries to look away from the suffering and the horror that's going on. And that's a way that humans react sometimes when they're maybe overwhelmed with the tragedy that's surrounding them, or maybe feeling guilty but not knowing how to act. That was something that I very much wanted to describe, that I could do from my position as an English person.
Great. So, with your indulgence, I'm going to take a few moments to try and explain the idea and practice of Afropolitanism. To this, he may not yet be acquainted with the concept. So as I see it, Afropolitanism is a concept that seeks to put into words the desire and need by Africans and African-descended peoples to assert themselves as human subjects, complete with the right to live and move and have their being in a globalized space. As practice, it comprises actions that seek to remove barriers to African mobility. These actions include, but are not limited to, writing, poetry, creative fiction, and critical works. Afropolitanism can bring into view at a level of narrative the constraints that are used to hold back Africans and African-descended peoples and the changes that are required to expand cosmopolitan spaces for Africans and African-descended peoples. I use the word mobility to refer both to the freedom to move between and among different countries and the freedom to move upwards and sideways into different circles, socially and economically. In seeking to assert the humanity of the African subject, Afropolitanism affirms African people's capacity to know, understand, and describe the world in legitimate and authoritative ways. Not all critics are sold on the concept of Afropolitanism, however. Some have argued that Afropolitanism concerns itself with writings that cannot rightly be considered to be African. For them, a writing can only be African when authored by Africans based in Africa. Others also argue that Afropolitanism speaks to the self-indulgent aspirations of bourgeois Africans who are unrepresentative for the vast majority of the continent. Still others argue that Afropolitanism exoticizes Africa. A critique that I have a bit of sympathy for is the idea that Afropolitanism presupposes a need to justify African cosmopolitanisms and globalities. I would argue that Africa and the experience of Africa is not limited to the geographical bounds of the continent. I would like to grant all African subjects, bourgeois and otherwise, the right to creative agency and a perspective on things. Regarding the criticism that the concept of Afropolitanism somehow suggests that transnational African mobility needs to justify itself, I would argue that it is asserting itself, not justifying itself. And those are different things. So in my work, I use the concept of critical Afropolitanism to describe the right of the African subject to live out, know, and express a full and varied human experience. So this is just one of the reasons why I'm excited to discuss your novel with you. I don't know, how would you compare the situation surrounding the unholy trinity of race, class, and gender in Ghana, the UK, and Germany, in the global space, basically, as well as ableism, which is a subject we do not hear as much about?
How do I bring them together?
Yeah, how would you compare the situation, surrounding, basically these three, some people call that the unholy trinity of race, class, and gender, and how would you compare the situation in Ghana, in the UK, in Germany, mainly, but generally in the global space?
Okay, I'll try. So I had to think about your question very carefully because of the introduction with the Afropolitanism. I'm trying to think how it fits in with what you've just explained. And I think that one question mark that Afropolitanism brings to me, I'm not really, I don't understand that much about Afropolitanism, but what I've understood is that it's trying to describe something that I think has existed all along. Africans have been traveling all along and existing in many different regions. In fact, I think the African Union considers the diaspora to be the 6th region, if I remember correctly. So I don't understand why we need the term Afropolitanism. I don't know. It felt to me like that was a class distinction. So the migrations that have been happening, for example, enslaved Africans being taken forcibly outside of Africa, but also, for example, people like my parents or Ada's father in 2019 who moved to the UK to do they were invited to the UK to come and work in National Health Service or public transport, or my mother worked as a seamstress and then as a cook, like these working class jobs, I would say. That was a thing that was happening. And then suddenly, through a turn of politics that I still can't follow, this type of migration is labeled, what's it called, economic migration, and is seen as a terrible thing. Whereas if you're somebody who's considered to be a high flyer and moving around in these circles where you might have your morning meeting in New York and your evening meeting in Sydney, that's okay. I don't really get it. And therefore, with the unholy trinity of race, class, and gender, I think it seems to me that somebody needs to consider them separately, where it doesn't make sense for me as a black woman from a working class background to consider them separately. They definitely intersect with each other, and that's why the book is written the way it is, that the book begins with 3 different geographical areas and 3 historical eras that seem to be completely separate and have nothing to do with each other. But in the second half of the book, they're all brought together again by this one figure who was born here and raised here but now lives here, and all the different traumatic histories that go with those regions all feed into her lived experience in 2019. I would say it's sometimes helpful to separate something out for analysis, but it has to be a means to an end. It has to have a practical application at the end of the day so that you can make a difference to people's lives who are living these things. And separating them out and putting new terminologies on things doesn't always make a lot of sense, I think.
All right, so thank you. Now, do you think the ever-growing dominance, I'm shifting the conversation slightly here, do you think the ever-growing dominance of English as a universal language has implications for other languages and how we conceive of and express human experience?
Yes, it does. Yes, I had this interesting experience of growing up as somebody actually who was monolingual, but I lived in a household where other languages were spoken. So I had a concept of understanding that other languages existed and were important and communicated things that weren't necessarily possible to express in English. You know, there was different things that my parents were saying that I didn't have access to, but I knew emotionally they couldn't say what they were saying in English. And so for me, languages was always very fascinating, and it was something that I really wanted to get deeply into. In the end, it was only German that I took to any level of fluency. But I think languages also contain philosophies. It's a specific way of looking at the world when you speak from one perspective or another. So I've also experienced, so for my schoolmates, classmates who also grew up monolingually but didn't have the additional languages in their household, often it's difficult to conceive of what it means to speak a lover language, right? It's difficult to conceive of English having a specific perspective. Also, because English is so dominant in popular culture, social media, of everything that comes from the US, pop music, and so on, it's difficult to conceive that actually this is one way only of looking at the world. And I remember when it was really funny. I was talking to my brother about my German studies when I was studying German, and I was trying to do a translation. This will be in the 90s, so it will be before Google. And my brother was like, yeah, but what's the problem? Just look up the word in the dictionary and write it down and Bob's your uncle, right? And I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. There's a whole word order to consider, the grammar to consider, but also idioms. You can't just translate idioms word for word. And that's something that people who do not speak more than one language don't have access to, I would claim. And also, I think there is a benefit, I think, for having a language where many people can speak it to some level of fluency. I appreciate English for that. Mm-hmm. It does give you shortcuts for communication sometimes in situations. But then there is a loss as well, because then people think, oh, it's sufficient to speak English. We've got all the information we need. Mm-hmm. And it's so beautiful, actually, when you learn additional languages and realize, oh, there's a lot more that's going on that's kind of flying under the radar because we don't understand. There's just literally other philosophies and other ways of looking at the world. So on the one hand, it's great that my book is now available in English. John, if you're listening, it's great that my book is available in English. And it's a shame that many people won't be able to access it in the German original, because I would claim the German original is slightly different again and contains a little bit more texture than what can possibly be conveyed in the English translation.
So just briefly, Ada's realm is flavored by a great mix of languages and accents. I'm just building on that. So we have Ga, we have Tree, Igbo, Portuguese, French, English, and German. And it's possible that I have left something out. So I just wanted you to say something about what work that proliferation of languages is doing. You know, what are you looking to achieve?
Yeah, I think one of the things I was looking to achieve was everything that I just explained, to kind of demonstrate it in the text. Okay. There are certain parts of the novel where I'll write a phrase. I wrote some things in Polish, for example, which is not a language I speak at all. But I have good friends who helped me proofread that sentence, and I wanted to convey something very specific with that word. I wanted, for example, to say to people who may speak Polish, that's what that character was feeling at that particular time, and it has to be said in this specific Polish word. I also have a section where I speak about dominance of languages, but I don't use English when I'm speaking about that. I use two languages that are spoken in Ghana. That's Ga and Tree. So Tree is the language that's spoken in pretty much all of Ghana. And then Ga is the language that's spoken in the capital of Ghana. But because so many people speak Tree, and because people who speak Tree are also moving to the capital, Ga is more and more being pushed out as a language, and it could be in the next generation or next 2 generations to come, it won't be spoken anymore. And this is a very painful thing. My parents are Ga speakers, and I also don't speak the language. And somehow I wanted to capture that, this sense of loss when societies develop in that way and one language is dominant and it excludes others. So that was partly what I wanted to do with the novel. I also partly wanted to look at hierarchies within languages. So I've talked about the fact that there's a part of my novel which looks at these West African languages, which in some contexts are deemed to be undesirable. If I said to anybody, oh, I speak 2 languages fluently, and then I named one of these West African languages as the second language, that wouldn't be so impressive. If I say I speak 2 languages fluently and it's English and German, that's kind of much more impressive. I wanted to look at that a little bit. And I also was kind of influenced by discourse around multilingualism in European countries. So there's a big focus on you've got to speak this language so that you belong, and you've got to speak it well, and if you don't, then you don't belong or you're not integrated. So for example, the reason I don't speak my parents' first language is because that was the dominant story. I had to learn to speak English and learn to speak English well, and then I'll definitely belong, and everything else I should try to unlearn. And that happens a lot in Germany too, where we're told migrants and people living here, 2nd, 3rd generation, they should speak German even at home and not speak their home, unless they speak French or Spanish, maybe that's okay, but other languages, actually not. And I wanted to say that's ridiculous. Human beings are, I would claim, inherently multilingual. Even if they only speak 1 language, they speak different registers of language, right? You speak differently to your best friend than you would speak to your employer, than you might speak to your grandparents, and that's a good thing. It's dynamic and it's communication. I also use dialects in the book. In the German original, I use a specific dialect from the center of Berlin, which is also considered to be kind of a working class dialect and frowned upon in certain social circles. And that's a dialect that I put directly at the heart of the book, right? And this was really nice that John had to find a solution for that. Translating a dialect is not very easy. And he worked with another academic, Anya. Hello, Anya, if you're online. And they translated the Berlin dialect into a Northern Irish dialect. So those were some of the choices that were made.
Brilliant. So we're going to have one more reading, and then I think we're going to have questions from the audience.
One more reading.
Yes, please.
Do you have a preference about what I should read?
I think I'm going to have you choose one more time.
I'll do that then.
Thank you.
I'll then just read. So the first thing I read was the opening few pages of the novel. The opening chapter is divided into 3 sections, and in rapid succession, 3 women are introduced. And I'll read the section that introduces the second woman, which is based on the historical figure Ada Lovelace, who was a mathematical genius. It said that she was the writer of the first computer programs. And in this section, the reader eventually realizes that she's in a love affair relationship with Charles Dickens. This is not a historically researched situation. It's just something that I allowed myself to do because I'm a creative writer. So. Stratford-le-Bow, March 1848, I glanced back at him while he dressed. First the stockings, then the trousers, never the other way around. Then his undershirt, shaken out 2 times. He worried otherwise that his overshirt would not sit properly. The tips of his elegant fingers encircled the buttons, one after the other, and he quivered with rage. Cher Charles. I could have avoided this argument if I had merely conceded to agree with him unconditionally. And I often did, especially in those days, because it had become exceedingly exhausting to quarrel with men like Charles, men who actually considered themselves to be the good ones, and yet between the Africans on one side and the women on the other, never knew where to expect the next challenge to their God-given authority, and therefore fought preemptively on every front at once. The confidence with which he had presumed to tell me something of probability theory was actually quite comical. It would seem the constricting impact of a corset affected both men and women alike. I kept my internal commentary, darling, what actually goes on in that little head of yours, to myself, and counted silently to 10. He held one of my calculations for the analytical engine in his hand, reading glasses balanced on the tip of his nose. He tapped on one of the lines with his index finger. Perhaps it had been rather rude of me not to acknowledge him at once. "You've made an error here," he said. "There's a comma missing." I examined the spot without turning my head, then returned my gaze to him, and I decided on the response. "Thank you, my dear." I sat at my writing desk, quill pen in hand, and dipped the nib into my inkwell. I appended the missing comma to the sentence, "As soon as an analytical engine exists, it will necessarily guide the future course of the science." He had nodded, removing his reading glasses and cleaning them with his cotton handkerchief. "And what, precisely, does analytical signify in this context?" So, I remember looking up at him, misinterpreting his earnest stare, and admittedly my subsequent lecture was a bit long-winded. His eyes had glazed over by the time I arrived at my conclusion. "One day, we will even be able to compose music with it," I had raved. "The applications are limitless." What had prevented him from simply delighting in this with me? What a pitiful little man, I had thought. How he toyed sulkily with his goatee as he countered, "If what you are describing were possible, a real scientist would have developed it." If I had merely kept my peace, we could have continued lying together side by side in the warmth of my bed. But after a certain point, even the last spark of artificial humility fizzles out. "Yes," I had nodded, "you're quite right, and I am that scientist." His cheeks had flushed. In answer to his question as to what I meant by this, I could only look away, lowering my gaze, and of course, that had not sufficed as an apology for Charles. I rose from my writing desk as he turned away and began to pull on his trousers with great theatrical gesticulations. I know, I should have said something. I struggled to find the proper words, but I did not want to show how much his outburst had amused me. My forehead began to itch precisely at that moment when his faith in me began to erode away once more. It was, for the umpteenth time, the beginning of the end. Thank you.
Sure. So we're going to take questions now from the audience. Please.
You need a roving mic.
Thank you both. That was really interesting. As I was listening, a question
I don't remember. I really genuinely don't remember, but I can tell you roughly at the beginning, it was first a character in a short story that I wrote, the Herr Gröttrup story. Ada appears in that story, as you know, as the cleaning lady. And the specific thing that happens is the story ends up being narrated from the perspective of a soft-boiled egg. Don't ask why. It just happens. And the title, Herr Gröttrup, doesn't understand what's going on, why his soft-boiled egg is still soft, although it was boiled for exactly 7.5 minutes, because it's a science, he knows these things. And it's alluded to in the story that if he had deemed this character, Ada, as a person who would have relevant knowledge, he would have found out why this soft-boiled egg had remained soft. She appears in the story as quite, she appears in the story, she's the cleaning lady. He doesn't even really know she exists because she usually comes so early, he never sees her. And all we know about her is that that's her name, Ada, that she's recently learned to speak German, and then somehow she has some knowledge. And I remember when I was writing the story and the name came up, I thought it fitted really well because it's a name that exists in many different cultural contexts. And it suited my purpose very well that this character could be placed anywhere. So Ada is a name that I've talked about, Ada Lovelace. Ada is a Nigerian name. Ada is also a region in Ghana. There's a place there, Adafwa, which I referred to in the novel. It's also used in my novel as a shortening of a Polish name. And I could have written any number of stories about a woman called Ada, and I think I could have placed her all over the world, and I really liked that idea.
Okay.
So you talk about different objects in your book. The spiritual being kind of occupies different objects. I remember that one of them is a passport. I was wondering how and why you chose these objects, and if you thought about including different objects as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think about everything, and of course I plan everything, and it's all supposed to be the way it turns out, right? Specifically, okay, so very briefly, the reason that there's a being that inhabits different objects is also to do with this short story. I've spoken already about this soft-boiled egg. As the story continues to be told, we realize that it's a being that happens to be an egg on that particular morning. And it had hoped that it would just be in the fridge and just chill. That's literally a quote from the story. I just wanted to chill. And then it's, for some reason, taken out of the fridge and boiled. And because it doesn't like this hair grötrup, it decides just not to become hard-boiled, right? That's the story. And then I had to explain, why would an egg be refusing to be hard-boiled? What is this? And I came up with the concept that this is a being that keeps being forced to come back to Earth. And already in the short story, it's different. It remembers that it was different things. And then in the novel, I took some more time to explain the background of the being and its quest. I think the first object that I chose was the broom in West Africa. That came about because I was describing a scene, actually from the first-person perspective of Ada. And I was describing how she was being hit. And at some point I was like, what does the broom think about being used as a weapon? So that's how that came about. And the reason I chose the passport was because that part of the novel was set in 2019. And I'd also been giving some funding I've been given some funding for this novel to talk about themes that were relevant and pertinent to 2019. And we might remember that Brexit was happening around that time, and that was a lot. That was really on my mind. It was a lot on the mind of many British people who are living in Germany, because, of course, radically affected what kind of freedom of movement we had in Europe, and with what kind of right we could be living in this country, which we'd taken for granted. I've been living in Germany at least 10 years before Brexit, and then suddenly I had to think about it. I was, by then I was living and moving around as a writer, and I thought, what will I have to now apply for visas every time I go to Austria? This doesn't make sense. And it reminded me again about the arbitrariness of nationality, that people think, okay, I have a passport, this is me, I'm set for life. But actually, these rights can be given and taken at the drop of a hat, actually. And I just wanted to think about that. So the being becomes specifically a British passport at the time of Brexit in Germany. And it's a big crisis, right? This being is like, what am I? Who am I? What's happening to me? That's why I chose that.
I'd like to share a bit of serendipity with you. Mm-hmm. When this talk crossed my computer screen, I almost fell off my chair because Ada had crossed my desk literally an hour earlier. My Ada was a historical figure, and she cross-cuts across many of your things. Ada was the most senior woman in German East Africa. Wow. So Ada Schnee was the wife of the last governor of German East Africa, now Tanzania. But Ada Schnee her ancestry starts in Ireland. It goes to Birmingham. It goes to Australia during the gold rush. And she is born in New Zealand. And she wants to become an actress. So she ends up in New York in 1901, and she runs into this sexy German colonial official called Heinrich Schnee.
Are we sure he was sexy, though?
Well, the people dispute this, but they get married, literally, instantly, in New York in 1901. And she, like you, then has to learn German, and then she has to become, or learn to be, the senior Bibi Mkubwa, the big woman in Germany's largest colony. And she ends up in Berlin. So there is a historical Ada who crosscuts many of your, and I can tell you a bit more about her later.
I'd love to know more about her. Yes, yes, thank you.
There's a lot of questions. There's one at the front here.
Hiya, thanks so much for that. I just wanted to ask, you seem to be someone who likes to play with perspective, some that are deeply human, some that you can relate to, but some that are also really alien and jarring. I wanted to know how that affects you as an author and how it makes you, does it make you more agile, does it make you more empathetic, but also how you think it affects the reader, and if you've had any particular reactions to some of the perspectives that you've written on, negative or positive.
Okay. Yes. Negative. I have to think about the negative responses. But I think my job as a writer is to take the readers along on an emotional journey. So I've been a writer who writes academic texts or activist texts or journalistic texts, and I see, of course, a role for those texts. If I'm writing something where I want to persuade somebody of an argument, it's important to start from point A and then go through each step and bring them along with me until we get to point Z. But I think that kind of writing has to simplify everything. You have to be able to follow it logically, which means you leave some of the nuance off here and there. And my chance with creative fiction is I can bring people along on an emotional journey, which is often messy, contradictory. You're laughing 1 second, crying the next second. And I think me being... I've since learned this about... The internet is great, right? Because you can do self-therapy and such. And I've learned that I'm a highly sensitive person. And I think that makes a difference because what I try to do is to find the emotion in the story. So if I'm writing something, I'm trying to access a specific emotion, which means I go through that emotion to some extent as well, with the aim that when my reader, what I'm actually trying to do is take my reader seriously enough to say, this is what I'm trying to tell you and come along with me on this emotional journey. And if I do that, if I take that seriously and do that well, then the story hits different. It's not an intellectual exercise, it's something that you experience. I want to say not everyone is a fan of that. I want to say you have to kind of... So my novel takes you on a very complex journey. You're often confused. You're often wondering, where the hell am I? And at some point you have to make a decision, yeah, I'm going to go along with this or I'm not. And the people who go along with it, who just let go of all their need to understand the story on an intellectual level and go along with it, they, I think, typically end up enjoying the ride and understand at the end what they had from going along with it. But there are many people who don't like that. I would say a lot of people in Germany who knew that I was a political activist, I think they expected me to write something that was more didactic and that would explain, for example, the authentic nature of being a black person in Berlin. And I didn't really deliver on that. I mean, I guess in parts I delivered on it, but I challenged people a lot with things, and I think that if you want someone to tell you a serious story that you can learn from very quickly, and then they present you with a doorknob doing whatever the doorknob, it's kind of, they might feel not taken seriously as a reader. So there is a certain amount of me challenging people with that kind of perspective.
Can I bring in a question from online?
Yes.
From Caroline Rowan Olive, and it's good to have all of you online. If you have any questions, do put them in with a Q&A. Thank you for both the novel and the talk. The novel addresses the moment of colonisation in the fate of both the first Ada and her brother. I'd like to read more about post-colonial approaches to literature. Any suggestions, please?
Post-colonial approaches to literature. Well,
You could also pass over to Shallow.
that's a great idea. I don't know that much about that, so Shallow might know more. You were thinking that you were just going to relax.
You put me on the spot. I think this is for.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of literary criticism or something like that, I don't know so much. That's not my field. But other novels to read, the first novel that comes to mind is Homegoing by Ya Jassi. I would recommend that very much. That's also one of the novels that I was reading while writing. And Homegoing is a beautiful novel which follows the story of two sisters. They were both in my memory in West Africa, and then one marries a slave trader and one is enslaved, and it follows the generations of their families through the diaspora and in West Africa, and that's a very, very good start. Yeah.
Fantastic. There was a question up there, and then I'll come over.
I really liked how you said that learning another language also makes you learn another philosophy. And I grew up in Germany, speaking German, and then I feel like learning English opened up something for me, and I think a lot of Black Germans kind of love the English language for like giving them words like people of color, which we don't really have a word for, right? And I was wondering how learning German for you, like, and writing in German, how that opened up something up, like, to you, or what you learned about yourself.
That's a really good question. Oh God. Did I ever think I'd answer the question how German gave me something? But it did. Wait a minute. What I can definitely tell you is it was very hard to write this book in German for the reasons that you've just said. I experienced German, and I think I'm not the only, I think German native speakers also experience German as quite a clear language. I would say eindeutig, right? There's often a word for something and there's not really much room for movement on that meaning. Whereas I find English a word that brings a lot of, background music along with it. So I challenged myself to write this novel in German because partly I knew that the German I speak isn't the German of somebody who was born and raised in Germany, and that's okay. I wanted to say people like me, I would even claim it's important there are people like me, because otherwise German becomes also an ever decreasing language, right? And if this world is so focused on English as the international language of communication, then at some point you'll have a situation where less and less people are in, if you're going to learn a second foreign language, it's not usually German that you'll learn. So you'll need people like me to come along and say, hey, I like this. I used to say I really like German because although it's so clear, that also brings a lot of flexibility. You can build nouns, right? So the word for sick is krank, word for hospital is Krankenhaus, word for ambulance is Krankenwagen, the word for sister is Krankenschwester. I'm feeling it, I used to call it the Lego language. Anyway, and the other thing is, language is something that also builds community. And I want to say, for far too long, German language has been the domain of a certain homogenous group of people, and everything else was considered to be not German. And I want to say German literature has also been the domain of a homogenous group of people, and everything else was considered to be hyphen, right? Migrationsliteratur or Frauenliteratur or whatever. So for me, it was like an act of resistance, rebellion to write this novel in German. As hard as it was, we had a turbulent relationship, but in the end, I think it was good. And then the other thing I did was I tried to anyway use, we talked about this, using languages that aren't strictly German, but for me, they still belong to Germany. It's good if you have communities of people who speak Turkish German, and when they speak Turkish to their parents, and they speak German in school, but they speak to each other a third mixture of things. That's a good thing. It's a language that's being alive and growing, and that's something that I try to capture with the novel as well. And the beauty, I think, of this is that it's in a verlag, it's in a publishing house, S. Fischer, like it's there now, it's on the shelves, and I just think that was a very important intervention. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
There's a question over at the back there.
Thank you. You've answered the first part of my question, which was how you chose to write in either English or German. But the second part was, were you not tempted, or were you not allowed to translate it into English? Because obviously your English is fluent. And it says translated, but well, it seems to be.
No, it is. Sorry, I'm being flippant. Sorry.
No, it's interesting that it's been translated from the German by somebody else.
Mm-hmm. That was deliberate. I decided very early on that I wasn't going to translate it, and I can explain. It would seem intuitive that me being, I speak English, it's my first language that I speak fluently, and it would seem intuitive that I would do that. But the thing is, the act of translating is a different skill, and I think I just don't have that skill. I could translate a shopping list, right? But when I get into translating literature, or let me say, what I know of translation is that translators need to not only capture vocabulary, but they need to capture moods, concepts. They need to capture what what this novel is doing in German and in German society. They need to capture that sense and transport it over to a different context, a different language, but also a different feel, a different community of people, and try to find equivalencies that fit emotionally as well as just from the dictionary translation. And that's something that's an incredible skill. It also requires something like making harsh decisions. So I can give you one very good example. Although I said German is a very clear language, the one word that I found was Raum, which does something different in German than it does in English. So the German word Raum I chose deliberately because it can be interpreted in many different ways. And as you read the novel, the meaning of the word Raum kind of changes for you. It can mean room, it can mean space, it has connotations of space travel, for example. And the translator, John, had to make a decision, what word am I going to choose for the English translation? And then if I would claim if I had done that, then me choosing one of these words to name the novel would have made the German title much more fixed than I had intended it to be. And interestingly enough, the translator and I liked the word realm. I wouldn't have come up with that, but realm seems to encapsulate the sound of room, but it's also bigger. But this is a book that's got two editorial teams. So in the UK, it's called Ada's Realm. UK and Commonwealth, actually, is Ada's Realm. And then in North America, it's called Ada's Room, because they didn't like Realm. They felt it too spacey. So, and I really like that it's got two titles for that reason, so that people can choose. But the other reason that I wouldn't have translated it is because what would have happened is I would have been highly frustrated in the translation process and made some decisions differently to what I'd done in German, and then I would have wanted to change the German, and then it would have gone backwards and forwards, and then I wouldn't be here this evening.
Can I ask you, in a sense, to look into the future? And the explicit question I guess I would like to put to you is, when you're next invited here, what book are you going to talk about?
be the Nobel Prize winning book.
Can we?
Enlarge on that at all?
Would I like to enlarge on that?
No.
Yeah, no, I'm going to keep you hanging. I am working now on another book, but I don't think that will be the one that will win the prize. I have to come up with something else.
There's another question online from Salom Ahiadu, who says, I'm a British-born Ghanaian studying A-level German.
Oh, nice.
Is there any advice you would give to A-level students like myself looking to be bilingual, other than reading your book, of course?
First of all, stick at it, and don't worry about making mistakes, is my... we people who learn to speak German in later years and not from birth, the chances that we would ever learn the daddy das it's never going to happen for me anyway. I've given up on that. But we have Google Translate and apps. So keep speaking and keep enjoying the language. Do what you need to do to enjoy the language. When I was learning German, GCSE and A-levels, I used to listen to a lot of pop music in German. And I guess there's a lot of rap music now in German too. And I also used to try to playfully translate English pop songs into German. It sounded terrible, but it was a good way to just have fun with the language. That's what I would say. And plays are a very good way also. I found plays very fast to read, and it's nice to read dialogue and to get into the feel of how people communicate.
Fantastic tips. Back there, and then we may have time for only one more if there's...
Hello. Thank you for sharing. I'm so interested in what you said about sort of like speaking different languages and how, related to your question, language is so close to a cultural, it can be a cultural weapon. If you think about colonization, how, you know, when French people arrived in West Africa, the first thing they did was to teach French, for example. What's your process as a polyglot when you write, mixing all these cultures that come with, you know, languages?
What's my process?
Yeah.
Can you give me a bit more?
So do you, because I'm a writer as well, and in my head
Right.
I'm always thinking, when you write in a specific language, and if you write with many different languages in the same book or the play or whatever, you're inviting the audience to get in contact with different cultures.
Right.
So how do you negotiate like these different cultures for, let's say, a UK audience who has no idea what, let's say, the Ghanaian culture is, for example?
Yeah, okay, I think I understand. That's a nice question, thank you. I think what I try to do is write without footnotes, right? And that's part, going back to this thing of wanting people to experience the story. And part of my experience when I was growing up was, for example, living in this house, maybe some of you have had this as well, where your parents are speaking this language. The only part of the language you understand are the swear words, like, where they're threatening to beat you. That part is fluent, but the rest of it is like a mystery. And that feeling of, actually it's odd, because that language still sounds like home, even though I don't really understand it. And that's part of what I like to transport. So I don't expect my readers to understand every single word, not at all. What I would like them to do is to read that sentence and think, oh, I get the gist. In the context where I'm using this sentence, I get what the character is saying and feeling and going through. And that's very much a character-based thing. It's not something, I don't remember setting out to write a book with lots of different languages in it. I don't think that was the main thing. I think I set out to write a book about these particular figures, and then I thought, how would these particular figures speak and what would they say to each other? And one thing that I've struggled with, I'd like to ask other writers or other literature, people who study literature, is how do you write, how can I explain this question? So for example, in German, I'm writing a scene that takes place in the UK, in London. So it's clear when you're reading it that they're all speaking English, but the language I'm writing in is German. And then I go ahead and add some English words on top. I kind of feel instinctively that that's a mistake, but I didn't really figure out how to resolve it. So one thing you can do in films is you can add subtitles. But what do you do when you've got written text? It's a tension I haven't resolved.